In the summer of 1941, a 25-year-old lieutenant with no combat command of his own, partially paralyzed and walking on crutches, broke into British military headquarters in Cairo by climbing over a perimeter fence. He wasn't there to cause trouble. He was there to pitch an idea nobody in the regular chain of command wanted to hear, a plan for a small, unconventional raiding force that senior officers had already, in one form or another, quietly dismissed. Stuck on crutches, unable to walk normally, he had almost no way of getting past the sentries who guarded the entrance to General Headquarters through the front door, so he didn't use the front door. That single afternoon, a fence, a pair of crutches, a chase through the corridors of British Middle East headquarters, and a chance encounter with the wrong office followed by the right one, is the reason the Special Air Service exists at all. This is the story of what David Stirling actually did to get the SAS approved, and why an idea that should have died in a filing tray instead became one of the most influential military innovations of the Second World War. To understand why Stirling felt he had no choice but to go around the system, you first have to understand where his idea came from and why the system had already shown every sign of rejecting it. Stirling had joined No. 8 Commando in 1940, part of a larger formation that would eventually be known as Layforce, sent to the Middle East to conduct raiding operations against Axis positions along the Mediterranean coast. Layforce saw hard fighting in Crete and in the Litani River operation in Syria, and by the summer of 1941, it had suffered losses heavy enough that it was being wound down entirely. For a young officer who believed deeply in the potential of small, specially trained raiding units, watching an entire commando formation dissolve for lack of results was less a discouragement than a confirmation of a theory already forming in his mind. That theory, developed partly in conversation with a fellow officer, Jock Lewis, was built around a simple observation about how the war in North Africa was actually being fought. German and Italian forces depended heavily on a string of forward airfields along the Libyan coast to keep aircraft fueled, armed, and within range of the front line. Those airfields, by necessity, were large, sprawling, and lightly defended around their perimeters, heavily guarded against a frontal assault by a large force, but not against a handful of men slipping in on foot under cover of darkness. Stirling's proposal was that instead of committing an entire commando formation to a raid, with all the logistics, planning, and vulnerability that implied, a very small number of specially trained men, a few per target, could be parachuted into the desert at night, march the remaining distance to an airfield perimeter, plant explosive charges on as many parked aircraft as they could reach, and withdraw before dawn. It would trade scale for surprise, and it depended entirely on the idea that a handful of well-trained men, moving quietly, could do more damage to the enemy's war effort than a much larger conventional raid. It was, by his own later admission, a plan built partly out of frustration with how conventional commando operations of the period were being run, and partly out of a genuine, carefully reasoned insight into a specific weakness in the German supply chain. Whether senior commanders would see it the same way was an entirely separate question, and the early signs were not encouraging. Before Stirling could even attempt to pitch his idea formally, an accident very nearly took the decision out of his hands entirely. While training with a parachute unit, using improvised methods, since Britain's airborne forces in the Middle East at this stage had little formal parachute infrastructure to draw on, Stirling suffered a serious jump injury. Accounts describe his parachute canopy catching on part of the aircraft's tail assembly during the descent, resulting in a hard, poorly controlled landing that left him with injuries serious enough to temporarily paralyze his legs. He spent a period recovering in hospital, uncertain at various points whether he would regain full use of his legs at all. It would have been entirely reasonable, at that point, for the idea to quietly die along with Layforce's disbandment. An injured junior officer with no unit left to command, no rank to leverage, and no easy path back into a position where such a proposal might be heard. Instead, according to accounts from those who knew him at the time, the enforced stillness of a hospital recovery gave Stirling the uninterrupted time to think the plan through properly and commit it to paper as a formal written proposal, rather than leave it as an idea discussed casually between friends. On his release from hospital in July 1941, still on crutches and far from fully recovered, Stirling made a decision that shaped everything that followed. Rather than wait for a full recovery or attempt to work the proposal slowly up through conventional army channels, where he believed, with good reason, that skeptical middle-ranking officers would either shelve it indefinitely or reject it outright, he decided to take it directly to the top of Middle East Command. It is worth pausing here on exactly why Stirling believed the normal chain of command was a dead end, because this belief was not simple arrogance. It reflected a genuine, and in 1941, fairly accurate read of British military culture in the Middle East. Unconventional, small-unit raiding concepts were treated with open suspicion by a large portion of the conventional officer corps at the time. Layforce's own recent disbandment, after losses that many senior officers attributed to poor planning and unclear objectives for commando-style operations generally, had done nothing to help the reputation of irregular units. A junior lieutenant with no combat command of his own, proposing yet another small, unconventional raiding force, was exactly the kind of proposal a cautious middle-ranking staff officer had every institutional incentive to quietly bury rather than champion up the chain. Stirling's calculation, then, was straightforward. The only officer whose personal authority could override that institutional caution was the Commander-in-Chief of Middle East Forces himself, General Sir Claude Auchinleck. Anyone below that level, in Stirling's assessment, either lacked the authority to approve something this unconventional on their own initiative, or lacked the incentive to take the professional risk of championing it upward. If the idea was going to survive contact with the British Army's bureaucracy at all, it needed to reach the very top in one conversation before it could be diluted or dismissed on the way there. This is the reasoning that put a badly injured, still recovering junior officer on a set of crutches outside the perimeter fence of British Middle East headquarters in Cairo, attempting to reach a general who had almost certainly never heard his name before. Getting into general headquarters through the front entrance, under normal circumstances, would have meant navigating exactly the kind of layered bureaucratic gatekeeping Stirling was trying to avoid: sentries, appointment protocols, aides whose job was precisely to filter out officers without the standing to warrant the commander-in-chief's time. On crutches, without an appointment, and without the rank to request one credibly, Stirling had essentially no legitimate route through that front door. So he went around it. Using his crutches to help himself over a section of the perimeter fence, he made his way onto the grounds of the headquarters compound, avoiding the main checkpoints where his lack of authorization would have been immediately obvious. Once inside the building itself, he was spotted by sentries, and in the confusion that followed, ducked into the nearest office to avoid being intercepted, which happened, by pure bad luck, to belong to an officer he had previously clashed with, who reacted by calling for the guards rather than offering any sympathy for Stirling's mission. Forced to keep moving, Stirling made his way into a second office nearby. This time, the encounter went rather differently. The office belonged to Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie, at the time serving as Deputy Chief of the General Staff for Middle East Command, a senior officer with direct access to Auchinleck himself, and crucially, someone willing to actually listen rather than immediately call for security. Stirling, by most accounts a little breathless and entirely unapologetic about the manner of his arrival, explained his idea to Ritchie on the spot and handed over the written memorandum he had prepared during his hospital recovery. Ritchie read it, and rather than dismissing an obviously unauthorized intrusion out of hand, agreed to take the proposal directly to Auchinleck for consideration. 3 days later, Stirling returned to the same headquarters, this time through the front door with a proper pass at Ritchie's invitation, for a meeting with General Auchinleck himself. What made Stirling's written proposal persuasive enough to survive that meeting wasn't simply the boldness of how it had been delivered. Auchinleck was, by the summer of 1941, actively looking for ways to disrupt Rommel's supply lines and air power ahead of a major planned offensive, Operation Crusader, intended to relieve the besieged garrison at Tobruk. A concept that promised to strike multiple enemy airfields simultaneously, using a very small number of men and minimal logistics compared to a conventional raid, fit directly into a strategic problem Auchinleck was already trying to solve. The timing of Stirling's proposal, in other words, mattered almost as much as its content, a genuinely good idea, arriving at precisely the moment a commander-in-chief was receptive to unconventional solutions, rather than being filed away as an interesting thought experiment for some future campaign. Auchinleck approved the proposal, promoted Stirling to the rank of captain on the spot to give him sufficient standing to organize and command the unit he was proposing, and granted him authority to recruit a founding force of 6 officers and around 60 enlisted men. The unit was given a deliberately misleading name, L Detachment, Special Air Service, chosen in part to suggest to German intelligence, through deception operations already being run in the region, that Britain already possessed a far larger airborne force in the Middle East than it actually did. In reality, in July 1941, there was no SAS beyond the men Stirling was now authorized to recruit, and the idea he had carried through a fence and 2 office doors to get approved. Securing approval was only the first obstacle. Stirling now had a name, a rank, and permission to recruit, but almost nothing in the way of equipment, infrastructure, or institutional support to actually build a functioning unit around that permission. The new force established a training camp at Kabrit, on the shores of the Great Bitter Lake in Egypt, drawing many of its first recruits from the recently disbanded Layforce, men who already had some commando training and, in several cases, genuine appetite for exactly the kind of unconventional soldiering Stirling was proposing. Equipment, tents, and basic camp furniture in the unit's earliest days were obtained largely through improvisation, and by some accounts, a certain amount of resourceful borrowing from nearby units better supplied than a brand new force with no established quartermaster relationships of its own. This improvisational, faintly irregular approach to solving problems, evident in how Stirling had gotten the unit approved in the first place, became something close to a house style for the earliest incarnation of the SAS. Formal channels, when they existed at all for a unit this new, were treated as a starting point to work around rather than a fixed set of rules to follow to the letter, provided the underlying objective was sound, and the risk was one Stirling was personally willing to own. By November 1941, barely 4 months after that first chaotic meeting with Ritchie, L Detachment attempted its first operational mission in support of Operation Crusader, a parachute assault on Axis airfields that would go badly wrong for reasons entirely separate from how the unit had been formed. But the unit survived that disastrous opening mission, rebuilt its approach within weeks, and went on to destroy hundreds of Axis aircraft on the ground over the following months of the North African campaign, a record that would have been impossible without the unit having been approved and formed at all. It would be easy to treat the story of Stirling's fence-climbing, guard-dodging pitch to Ritchie and Auchinleck as simply a colorful anecdote, the kind of story that gets embellished with each retelling until it becomes difficult to separate fact from legend. Some of the finer details, understandably, have likely been polished by decades of retelling in exactly that way. But the substance of what happened is not seriously disputed, and it matters for a reason that goes beyond mere color. Stirling's read of the British military bureaucracy in 1941, that a genuinely unconventional idea, proposed by a junior officer with no combat command of his own, would be filtered out or diluted by layers of cautious middle management long before it ever reached someone with the authority to actually approve it, was almost certainly correct. Had he waited on crutches for a formal appointment through ordinary channels, or routed his proposal upward through the officers who had just presided over Layforce's disbandment, there is a reasonable case that the SAS, in the specific form it eventually took, would never have been approved at all, or would have been approved too late to take part in Operation Crusader in any form. What Stirling actually did to get the SAS approved was not, in the end, some singular act of extraordinary genius. It was a combination of a genuinely sound tactical idea, careful written preparation during an enforced hospital recovery, an accurate diagnosis of exactly which layer of command needed to hear the idea directly, and a willingness, physically painful, on crutches, with functioning legs still very much in question, to bypass every conventional obstacle standing between that idea and the one person with the authority to say yes. History remembers the special air service for the raids, the reputation, and the decades of imitation that followed, but none of it existed until one injured lieutenant decided that the surest way to get an idea approved was not to ask permission to be heard, but to make sure he was standing in front of the right general before anyone had the chance to stop him.